Welcome to the video for chapter 38 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to tell you about the aorist. Basically put, the aorist is another past tense. Originally, imperfect, perfect and aorist were different in their meanings, but in classical Sanskrit that difference does not survive, and all three are used more or less interchangeably, all simply refer to things that happened in the past. Among the three, the aorist is rarest, which is why it's introduced so late in this book. Perhaps its most regular use is after the little word ma to express prohibitions, i.e. negated commands such as don't do this, don't listen to him, and so on. We're going to look at these towards the end of this video. However, first of all, let's look at the aorist itself. There actually are 7 different ways of forming the aorist, and they're all here given mostly for reference. As we just said, most of them are fairly rare, so the perhaps most important thing is that you've seen each of them at least once. In a nutshell, aorist indicatives of all different types use the augment a and use the secondary endings, i.e. those that are also found in the imperfect. They differ in how their stem is formed, i.e. the bit between the augment and the endings. Here, just to give you a very general overview, is a table that contains sample paradigms from each type of aorist. If you just look at these forms very briefly, you will see that all of them begin with a, that's your augment, and within each person, so within the first singular, second singular, and so on, the different types all have the same endings. So, for example, all the first person singulars end in all the second singulars end in visarga, all the third singulars end in t, and so on. The only difference that you find is in the third plurals, where some types end in an, but some end in uch. And both an and uch are endings that we've seen in other past tense third person plurals. So, for example, in some irregular imperfects we found uch, and we have found uch throughout the third person plurals of the perfect in the active. The rest of this video is not a complete, but hopefully a practical guide to the aorist. Let's look at the various aorist types one by one. First of all, we have the so-called root aorist, in which the augment and secondary endings are added to just the verbal root, with this verbal root standing in different grades in different verbs. So, for example, from bhu, we have the root aorist abhuvam, abhuch, abhut, abhuwa, and so on. Notice that in the first singular, the ending is am, as we've also seen it in other athematic verbs. And in front of this in front of the vowel a, we find a w inserted, so the first singular is abuwam, and then it continues normally abuch, abut, and so on. Secondly, there is the a aorist, in which we find an augment and the secondary endings added to either side of the 0 grade root followed by the thematic vowel a. Among aorist formations, this type is rather frequent, and we get, for example, from wid, the a aorist awidam, awidach, awidat, and so on. Next up, the reduplicated aorist, which consists of the augment, the reduplicative syllable, the verbal root itself, either in guna or 0 grade, then the thematic vowel and secondary endings. The reduplicative syllable consists of, as usual, consonant and vowel, and the consonant, the root initial consonant, reduplicates according to the patterns that we already know, for example, from class 3 verbs or from perfects. But the vowel reduplicates according to fairly intricate patterns that we're not going to look at here in detail. If you do want to know all the details, you can find them, for example, in the book. This type of aorist is mostly formed of derived verbs, such as causatives, but here you can see a simple non-derived example. From the root jan, we find the reduplicated aorist aji jan am, aji janach, aji janat, and so on. Finally, we get a number of aorists that are formed by addition of s, which due to Rukhi can also appear as sh. In a nutshell, they consist of the augment, the verbal root in any of the three grades, then the addition of s, ish, sish, or sa, and finally your normal secondary endings. And in front of the s, you can find frequent internal sandhi. This is exactly the sandhi that you also find, for example, in the future before the suffix sya. These types overall are rather infrequent, and that's why they're here treated so very briefly. If you would like to know more about them, the book contains some details, and it also contains references to various grammars that give you all the information you might want to know. So, we have a variety of ways of forming the aorist, and overall the aorist is rather rare. So what's the best way of approaching all this new information? Well, from a practical point of view, what's most important is to be able to recognize the aorist. The types that are easiest to recognize, which is especially 1b but also 1a, which are very similar to the imperfect, are the ones that are found most frequently. So you should know how types 1a and 1b are formed, and you should be prepared to recognize the other types simply by the fact that they all contain the augment, the verbal root in any one of the three grades, and the secondary endings. A possible complication in recognizing an aorist form and identifying it correctly is internal sandhi, especially before s. So remind yourself of the devoicing, deaspiration, and velarization that you find before s, and remember that s can change into sh. If you're aware of all of these, recognizing the aorists that you come across should not be any great difficulty. Perhaps the most frequent use of the aorist, at least relatively speaking, is to express negated commands, also known as prohibitions, such as don't do this, don't go there, don't be late, and so on. These are formed by the use of ma plus an unaugmented aorist. So, for example, ma bhuch means don't be. Here we have ma plus the unaugmented root aorist of bhu, or ma shuchach, don't mourn, which contains ma and the unaugmented a aorist of shuch. In chapter 24, you can also find other ways of expressing such prohibitions or negated commands. That was it for this chapter. We hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. Please do write to us at ruppel@cambridge-sanskrit.org. And now, for your own work on this material, good luck and have fun!